The sun hung low in the sky, painting the horizon in soft shades of gold and amber. A cool breeze swept through the trees, rustling the leaves as it carried the faint scent of incense from the small monastery perched atop the hill. Sitting on the worn stone steps was an old monk, his robe simple, his posture relaxed, his hands gently rolling a string of wooden prayer beads. His name was Tenzin, and for many years he had lived in this quiet sanctuary, far from the noise of the world. That evening, as the last light of day faded, a visitor arrived. Mark climbed the uneven stone path leading to the monastery, his steps slow, shoulders heavy. His face bore the weight of years spent chasing something: success, security, happiness, but never quite finding it. His mind never seemed to rest. Worries about work, family, and the future followed him everywhere, a constant storm he couldn't escape. Tenzin watched as the man approached, his expression calm, knowing he had seen many travelers like Mark, people burdened not by what they carried in their hands, but by what they carried in their minds. Mark stopped at the base of the steps, hesitating for a moment before finally speaking. "I don't know what to do anymore," he admitted. His voice was quiet, but heavy with exhaustion. "My mind is always full of stress, fear, and regret. I can't seem to clear it. I try to let go, but the thoughts keep coming back. How do I stop them?" Tenzin didn't answer right away. Instead, he reached down and picked up a dry leaf that had fallen beside him. He turned it over in his hand, studying it as if it held a secret worth discovering. "Have you ever noticed," the monk said, at last, "that a leaf never clings to a tree forever?" Mark frowned slightly, not sure what he meant. Tenzin twirled the leaf between his fingers, watching as the wind caught its edges. "Your mind is like this tree," he continued. "Thoughts come and go, just as leaves do. But when you hold on to tightly, when you refuse to let go of the ones that have already served their purpose, you only create suffering." Mark let the words settle in. He had spent so much time trying to fight his thoughts, to silence them, to force himself into peace. But what if peace wasn't something to be forced at all? The old monk set the leaf down, smiling gently. "Come," he said, rising to his feet. "Let me tell you a story." Mark followed as Tenzin led him down a quiet path behind the monastery. He didn't know where they were going, but for the first time in a long while, he felt something new. Curiosity. Maybe, just maybe, there was another way. If you've ever struggled with an overactive mind, if stress and worry weigh you down, stay with me. This journey isn't just for Mark. It's for all of us. And if you find wisdom in these words, if this story speaks to you, please take a moment to like this video, share it with someone who needs it, and subscribe to the channel. Your support helps keep these teachings alive, so more people can find peace in the simple truths of life. Now, let's begin. Lesson 1. The flowing stream. Mark followed Tenzin down the narrow stone path behind the monastery, the sound of their footsteps blending with the quiet hum of the evening. The air was crisp, carrying the scent of damp earth and pine, and in the distance, he could hear the soft murmur of running water. As they walked, Mark's mind was still tangled in the same thoughts that had haunted him for years. He had read books about mindfulness, tried meditation apps, even attempted to think positive, but nothing ever seemed to last. His mind was a battlefield, constantly waging war against itself. He didn't understand how he was supposed to just let go. Ahead of him, Tenzin moved with an ease that seemed almost unnatural. Unhurried, unbothered, as if time itself did not exist for him. They soon reached a small stream nestled between moss-covered rocks, its water flowing smoothly over the pebbles beneath. Without a word, Tenzin knelt by the bank and dipped his fingers into the cool current. He gestured for Mark to do the same. "Feel this," the monk said. Mark hesitated before following suit. The water slipped between his fingers, steady and constant, as if it had been flowing this way forever. It's smooth, Mark said. Soft, Tenzin nodded. The mind is meant to be like this, fluid, clear, always moving. For a moment, Mark allowed himself to believe that. He imagined what it would be like if his mind felt like this stream. Light, effortless, free. But then, almost on cue, his thoughts rushed back in. Deadlines, unfinished work, conversations, replaying in his head. Regrets. His chest tightened. Tenzin, as if sensing his turmoil, suddenly reached for a handful of dirt and tossed it into the stream. Instantly, the clear water turned murky, swirling with mud and sediment. This, the monk said, is what happens when we hold on to negativity, stress, anger, regret. The more we cling to these thoughts, the cloudier our mind becomes. Mark stared at the water. That was exactly how his mind felt all the time. But Tenzin didn't seem concerned. He simply watched the stream, unmoving. At first, the water remained dark, but slowly, something changed. The current carried the dirt away, and the murkiness began to fade. Bit by bit, the stream returned to its natural clarity, as if nothing had ever disturbed it. Tenzin smiled. The stream does not fight to be clear. It does not hold on to the dirt, nor does it try to force it away. It simply allows the water to do what water does. Flow. Mark exhaled, something inside him loosening. But how? He asked. How do I let go? The monk dipped his hands into the water once more, letting it run through his fingers. The next time your mind feels heavy, close your eyes and picture this stream. Imagine your worries as fallen leaves drifting on the surface. Watch them come, and then watch them go. Mark hesitated, then closed his eyes. He pictured the stream. The way the water had carried the dirt away, he imagined his stress, his worries about work, his doubts about the future, floating like autumn leaves on the water's surface. Some moved quickly, carried away. Others hesitated, swirling for a moment before slipping downstream. But they all moved. When he opened his eyes, the stream was still there, flowing, peaceful, unchanged. Tenzin looked at him, his voice quiet but steady. No matter how troubled your past, you can always begin again. That night, as Mark lay in bed, his mind started its usual routine, pulling him into an endless loop of worries. But instead of drowning in them, he closed his eyes and returned to the stream. He let his thoughts drift. He let the current take them. And for the first time in a long time, he slept peacefully. If you've ever struggled with thoughts that won't seem to leave you alone, try this. Close your eyes and picture a flowing stream. Let your worries float like leaves on the water, and simply watch them pass. And if this lesson resonated with you, let me know in the comments. Have you ever tried this before? Do you struggle with letting go? I'd love to hear your thoughts. Lesson 2. The weight of clutter. The morning air was crisp as Mark stepped out of his small guest room at the monastery. The world felt quieter here. No buzzing phone, no blaring news, no overflowing inbox demanding his attention. Just the gentle rustle of leaves and the rhythmic chanting of monks somewhere in the distance. He hadn't slept that well in years. Something about the stream, about picturing his thoughts drifting away, had settled him in a way he couldn't explain. But as soon as he started thinking about going back home, back to the deadlines, the cluttered apartment, the endless cycle of stress, he felt the familiar weight creeping back in. Tenzin was already sitting outside, sipping tea as he watched the sun rise. Mark sat beside him. I tried what you said last night. The stream. Letting go. He paused. It worked. For a little while. The monk smiled. Letting go is not a one-time event. It's something you do over and over, just like the stream never stops flowing. Mark nodded, but something still didn't sit right. I feel like my mind is still full. Even if I let go of some thoughts, there's always more waiting to take their place. Tenzin set down his cup and motioned for Mark to follow. They walked through the monastery, past the temple, until they reached a small wooden door. The monk pushed it open, revealing a tiny room with only a simple mat, a wooden desk, and a single shelf holding just a few carefully chosen books. Mark took in the space, its simplicity almost shocking. There was no clutter, no piles of unfinished projects, no stacks of unopened mail, just space. And yet, it didn't feel empty. It felt light. Tenzin gestured around the room. What do you see? Mark hesitated. Not much. The monk smiled. Exactly. For a moment, they stood in silence. Then Tenzin turned to face him. A cluttered space creates a cluttered mind, he said. The more we hold on to, the heavier we feel. Mark thought of his own apartment. Papers covering every surface, boxes of things he hadn't touched in years. A closet filled with clothes he never wore. He thought of his desk at work, drowning in files, post-it notes, unopened messages. He never really noticed it before. But now, standing in this peaceful, uncluttered space, he realized how much weight he had been carrying. So, you're saying I need to clean my house? Mark asked, half joking. Tenzin chuckled. Not just your house, your life, your mind, your attachments to things that no longer serve you. When you create space, you invite peace in. Mark exhaled. He had always thought peace was something he had to find, like a treasure buried somewhere in the future. But maybe peace wasn't something he had to chase. It was something that was already there, waiting for him to make room for it. That afternoon, as he sat on the steps of the monastery, he made a decision. When he went home, he wouldn't try to change everything at once. He would start small. Maybe a single drawer, a single shelf. Just one thing. And then, he would let that space remind him of what was possible. If you've ever felt overwhelmed by your surroundings, take a moment to look around. What could you let go of? What no longer serves you? Try clearing just one space. Your desk, a closet, even just your nightstand. And notice how it makes you feel. Then, come back and share in the comments. Did you feel lighter? Did your mind feel clearer? I'd love to hear about your experience. Next, we'll talk about something even more powerful than space. Silence. Stay with me. Lesson 3. Seeking silence and solitude. That evening, as the sky faded into deep shades of indigo, Mark found himself walking through the monastery gardens. The distant hum of chanting had ceased, and the world around him felt still. No car horns, no ringing phones, just the whisper of wind through the trees and the rhythmic chirping of crickets. It was unsettling. He was used to noise, constant, unrelenting noise. At home, the television was always on, even if he wasn't watching it. At work, the chatter of coworkers and the endless ping of emails filled the air. Even when he was alone, his mind made sure the silence never lasted long. There was always something to think about, something to worry about. Now, standing in this deep quiet, he felt almost exposed, as if he had nowhere to hide from himself. Tenzin appeared beside him, as if he had been waiting for this moment. You don't like silence, he observed. Mark let out a dry laugh. I don't know what to do with it. The monk nodded knowingly. Most people don't. That's why they fill every space with sound, with distraction. But tell me, Mark, when was the last time you truly listened? Mark frowned. To what? Tenzin didn't answer. Instead, he gestured toward a nearby wooden bench and sat down. Mark followed, the gravel crunching softly beneath his feet. For a while, they just sat there, neither of them speaking. At first, Mark felt restless. His mind searched for something to hold on to, something to analyze, something to do. But the longer they sat, the more he started to notice things he had never paid attention to before. The way the wind rustled the leaves, each one creating a slightly different sound. The gentle rhythm of his own breath, rising and falling. The distant sound of water trickling from a nearby fountain. And beneath it all, something deeper. Stillness. Tenzin finally broke the silence. We spend so much of our lives running from this, he said. But silence is not empty. It is full. It is where we hear what we've been too busy to notice. Mark swallowed. He wasn't sure if the monk was talking about the world around them, or the world inside him. Tenzin turned to him. When was the last time you sat in silence with no agenda? Not to work, not to plan, not to fill the time. Just to be. Mark had no answer. The monk smiled. I want you to try something, he said. Each day, take just 10 minutes to sit in silence. No phone, no distractions. Just listen. To the world. To your breath. To whatever arises. At first, it will feel uncomfortable. That's because you are meeting yourself, perhaps for the first time. Mark exhaled, feeling a weight he hadn't even noticed beginning to lift. That night, when he lay down in bed, he turned off every sound. No background music, no TV, no distractions. Just silence. It felt foreign, almost too quiet at first. But then, just like in the garden, he began to notice things. The way his body relaxed, the steady rhythm of his breath, the peace hidden beneath the noise. And for the first time, silence didn't feel empty. It felt like home. If you've ever been afraid of silence, I encourage you to try this. Just 10 minutes a day. No distractions. No agenda. Just be. And when you do, come back and share. What did you hear? What did you notice? I'd love to know. Next, we'll talk about something even more powerful. Your breath. Stay with me. Lesson 4. Deep breathing exercises. The next morning, Mark found himself sitting on the monastery steps, watching the world wake up. The sky was a soft pale blue. The trees swayed gently in the breeze, and in the distance, he could hear the faint rustling of monks moving through their morning rituals. Everything felt calm. Everything felt still. But inside him, the familiar tension was creeping back. He had tried. He had sat in silence the night before, just as Tenzin had suggested. And for a moment, he had felt something. Peace. Maybe, or at least the beginning of it. But this morning, as his thoughts returned, as he started thinking about the life waiting for him outside this monastery, the old feeling returned. A tightness in his chest. A restlessness in his mind. Tenzin appeared, beside him, as if he had been expecting this. He sat down, folding his hands in his lap. Your mind is loud again. Mark let out a short laugh. It never stays quiet for long. The monk nodded as if he understood completely. The mind is like a wild horse, he said. It runs wherever it pleases, but do you know what tames it? Mark shook his head. Tenzin placed a hand over his heart. The breath. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The only sound was the whisper of the wind. Then, Tenzin straightened his posture and closed his eyes. Sit with me, he said. Let me show you. Mark hesitated, then followed his lead, shifting into a more comfortable position. Close your eyes. Tenzin instructed. Breathe in slowly through your nose. Feel your belly rise. Now hold it, and exhale through your mouth. Mark did as he was told, inhaling deeply, holding the air in his lungs for a few seconds before releasing it. Again, Tenzin said, his voice steady. Inhale, hold, and exhale. With each breath, something changed. The tightness in Mark's chest began to ease. The racing thoughts, though still there, felt softer, less urgent. His shoulders, which had been tense since he arrived, slowly relaxed. "Do you feel that?" Tenzin asked, opening his eyes. Mark nodded. "Yeah, I do." The monk smiled. "The breath is always here. It is your anchor. When the mind races, when the world feels overwhelming, return to it. It will always bring you home." Mark let the words settle. He had spent so many years trying to fight his thoughts, trying to think his way into peace. But maybe peace wasn't in thinking at all. Maybe it was in something simpler, something as natural as breathing. That day, as he moved through the monastery, he caught himself again and again, coming back to his breath in moments of frustration, moments of distraction. He paused. Inhale, hold, exhale. And every time, the world felt a little lighter. If you've been feeling overwhelmed, try this. Just 5 deep breaths. Inhale, hold, exhale. See what happens, and when you do, come back and tell me. Did you feel a shift? Did you feel even a little bit lighter? I'd love to know. Next, we'll talk about something deeply healing. Nature. Stay with me. Lesson 5. Connecting with nature. That afternoon, as the sun hung high over the monastery, Tenzin led Mark down a winding path through the trees. The air smelled of damp earth and wildflowers, the distant sound of birdsong filling the spaces between their footsteps. For the first time in a long while, Mark wasn't thinking about the past or the future. He was just here. After a while, they came to a clearing where a large, ancient tree stood alone. Its trunk was thick and gnarled, its roots stretching deep into the ground like veins. Tenzin stopped and placed a hand against the bark. "This tree has stood here for hundreds of years," he said, "through storms, through droughts, through seasons of loss and renewal. And yet, it does not resist. It bends with the wind, sheds its leaves when the time comes, and always, always continues to grow." Mark watched as a single leaf, golden with age, drifted from a high branch and spiraled gently to the ground. "It doesn't fight change," Tenzin continued. "It surrenders to it." Mark swallowed. He had spent most of his life doing the opposite, resisting, gripping tightly to control, fearing what would happen if he let go. But standing here, in the quiet company of this ancient tree, he wondered what it would be like to live differently. Tenzin motioned for him to sit beneath the tree. Mark lowered himself onto the grass, feeling the cool earth beneath his palms. "Close your eyes," the monk instructed. "Listen." Mark hesitated but obeyed. At first, he heard nothing. Then, slowly, he started to notice things he had never paid attention to before. The whisper of the breeze through the branches, the rustling of leaves shifting against each other, the distant chirp of crickets. The longer he listened, the more the sounds seemed to blend together, forming something deeper. A rhythm, a pulse, life. Tenzin spoke softly. "The earth is always speaking to us, but we are too distracted to hear it." Mark exhaled, letting the words settle. For so long, he had seen nature as something separate from himself, something to visit, something to admire from a distance. But now, sitting beneath this ancient tree, feeling the steady rise and fall of his own breath, he realized something. He wasn't separate from nature. He was part of it. When he finally opened his eyes, everything looked different. The colors seemed richer. The air felt crisper, and the wind against his skin was no longer just wind. It was something alive, something connected to him. Tenzin stood, brushing the dirt from his robes. "Whenever you feel lost, return here," he said, tapping his chest. Not to this place, but to this stillness. The trees, the sky, the earth, they will remind you of what is real. That evening, Mark found himself sitting outside, staring up at the vast stretch of stars above the monastery. He had spent his whole life looking for peace in accomplishments, in possessions, in distractions. But maybe peace wasn't something to chase. Maybe it was something to remember. If you've been feeling disconnected, take a walk outside today. Find a tree, a river, a quiet patch of earth, and just sit. Close your eyes. Breathe. Listen. And if you do, come back and tell me. What did you notice? Did you feel different? I'd love to hear about it. Next, we'll explore something even deeper. Meditation. Stay with me. Lesson 6. Meditation. That night, as the monastery settled into stillness, Mark sat outside, staring at the flickering lanterns that lined the temple steps. The air was cool, carrying the scent of burning incense, and in the distance, the rhythmic chanting of the monks had faded into silence. He should have felt at peace, but his mind was still restless. Tenzin, as if sensing this, appeared beside him, settling onto the stone step with practiced ease. "You are still searching," the monk said. Mark let out a breath. "I don't know how to stop." Tenzin nodded, unbothered by the admission. "Close your eyes," he said. Just for a moment, Mark hesitated but obeyed. The darkness behind his eyelids felt heavy, like stepping into an unfamiliar room. He waited, expecting something profound to happen. But all he heard was his own breathing. All he felt was his own body, tense from years of holding on. Then, the thoughts came, a flood of them, random, disjointed. The past, the future, things he hadn't thought about in years. His eyes flew open. "I can't do this," he muttered. "My mind won't shut up." Tenzin smiled, as if he had been expecting that exact response. "Meditation is not about stopping the mind," he said. "It is about noticing it." Mark frowned. "That's it? Just noticing?" "These here." Monk nodded. "Imagine sitting by a road, watching cars pass by. Some are loud, some are fast, some may even be distracting, but you do not chase them. You do not try to stop them. You simply watch." Mark thought about that for a moment. He had always assumed meditation was about achieving some perfect, empty state of mind. But what if it was just about observing, letting his thoughts come and go instead of clinging to them? Tenzin continued, "Try again. Close your eyes, but this time, instead of fighting your thoughts, just notice them. Let them pass like clouds in the sky." Mark took a slow breath and tried again. The thoughts were still there, but this time, he didn't try to push them away. He just watched them come and go. Some stayed longer than others. Some drifted by, without much notice. But eventually, the space between them grew wider, quieter. For the first time, he felt something shift. Not a grand revelation, not an overwhelming peace, but a subtle awareness that beneath the noise, there was stillness. He opened his eyes, blinking at the soft glow of the lanterns. Everything around him looked the same. But inside, something felt different. Tenzin smiled. The mind will wander. That is its nature. But each time it does, gently bring it back. Again and again. That is meditation. Mark nodded, the weight on, his shoulders feeling just a little lighter. The next morning, as he sat by the stream, he tried it again. Just 5 minutes. His mind wandered. He brought it back. And for the first time in a long time, he wasn't trying to force his thoughts away. He was simply learning to watch. If you've ever struggled with meditation, try this. Just sit, close your eyes, and breathe. Don't force stillness. Just observe. And when your mind wanders, Gently return. Do this for 5 minutes, and then come back and tell me, what did you notice? Did anything shift? I'd love to hear your experience. Next, we'll talk about something that changes everything. Gratitude. Stay with me. Lesson 7. Practicing gratitude. That evening, as the sky turned a dusky shade of violet, Mark sat outside the monastery, watching the last of the daylight fade. The air was crisp, carrying the scent of earth and pine, and for the first time in a long while, he felt no urgency to be anywhere else. Tenzin joined him, settling onto the stone steps with a quiet presence. Between them sat a small clay cup, steam rising from the tea inside. The monk lifted it gently, holding it for a moment before taking a slow sip, as if he were savoring something far beyond the taste. Mark watched him, then let his gaze drift down to his own cup. He wrapped his hands around the warmth, feeling the heat seep into his fingers, the scent of herbs curling softly into the night air. It was just tea, nothing special. And yet, in this moment, it felt like enough. Tenzin set his cup down and looked at him. Do you know what gratitude really is? Mark thought for a moment. Being thankful for what you have? The monk smiled. More than that, gratitude is the practice of noticing what is already here. A breeze passed through the trees, rustling the leaves. Somewhere in the distance, a bird sang its last song of the evening. The world around them was full of sound, full of movement, full of quiet beauty. How many times had he walked through his life without really seeing any of it? We are always waiting for something. Tenzin continued, waiting for the next achievement, the next milestone, the next reason to be happy. But what if happiness is not something we wait for? What if it is something we see? Mark exhaled, staring down into the amber liquid in his cup. He had spent so much of his life thinking that peace, contentment, enough, was just over the next hill, waiting for him in some distant future. But maybe he had been looking in the wrong place. The monk reached into his robe and pulled out a small notebook, placing it between them. Each night before you sleep, reflect on your day. Find something, just one small thing, that you were grateful for. Not something grand, not something extraordinary. Just something simple. A moment. A kindness. A breath. Mark hesitated before picking up the notebook. The weight of it in his hands was light, but the idea behind it felt heavy, in the best way. That night, as he lay in bed, he turned the pages and thought back over the day, the warmth of the tea, the sound of the wind through the trees, the quiet company of a wise old monk who had given him nothing more than time and yet, somehow, had given him everything. He let the pen move, writing down what he had noticed, what he had felt, and as he closed the notebook and placed it beside him, he realized something. Gratitude wasn't about chasing after the big things, it was about opening his eyes to the small ones. If you've ever felt like something was missing, try this. Tonight, take a moment to reflect on your day. Find one thing, just one, that made you pause, that made you feel something, even for a second. Notice it, honor it, and if you do, come back and share. What did you find? I'd love to hear what you discover. As the final morning at the monastery arrived, Mark stood at the top of the stone steps, looking out over the valley below. The mist was still clinging to the hills, and the rising sun painted everything in soft gold. He hadn't realized how much lighter he felt until now. For years, he had carried the weight of his thoughts, his worries, his endless striving. He had always believed that peace was something he would reach someday, when he had accomplished enough, when life finally slowed down, when everything was just right. But now, standing in the quiet morning air, he understood. Peace was never something to be found. It was something to be made. Tenzin appeared beside him, hands folded, eyes gentle. You are leaving today. It wasn't a question. Mark nodded. I think I'm ready. The monk studied him for a long moment, then smiled. The world outside will not change, he said. The noise, the demands, the distractions, they will all still be there. But you have changed. Mark exhaled, a slow breath that felt deeper than any he had taken before. He knew Tenzin was right. The lessons of the past few days weren't meant to stay within the walls of the monastery. They were meant to be carried into the world, to be practiced in the middle of busy days, in moments of frustration, in times of uncertainty. As he turned to leave, Tenzin placed a hand on his shoulder. Remember, he said, you do not have to be perfect. You only have to return to your breath, to the present, to yourself, again and again. Mark swallowed, nodding. He didn't have all the answers, but he knew now that he didn't need to. The path was always there, waiting for him to step back onto it. As he made his way down the stone path, he realized something. The world hadn't changed, but the way he saw it had. The morning air felt fresher, the sound of the birds clearer, the rhythm of his own breath steadier. For the first time in a long time, he wasn't rushing toward the future or drowning in the past. He was simply here. And that was enough. If this story resonated with you, if you've ever felt lost in the noise of life, know that peace is always within reach. It's in your breath, in stillness, in the small, quiet moments you take for yourself. And if this journey has meant something to you, I'd love to hear your thoughts. Share in the comments what lesson spoke to you the most. And if you haven't already, don't forget to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share this with someone who needs it. Let's continue this journey together. You are always one breath away from coming home to yourself.